just like the fall air.
Nice and chilly.
Yeah. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Marvelous Music. The first one that is on video and not on a Zoom call, which is really rad. So I've got my coffee, I've got my water back here, and I've got my wife.
Hi.
This is Grace. We're married.
True story.
You know, video was my idea, and then each time now that I've set up to do a video, I'm like, this was a bad
we
idea.
weren't meant for video.
Like, there's so much less pressure. Because when I record with, like, Keegan or Ben, I'll just be sitting there and usually, like, staring blankly. And I may make eye contact, but I just completely, like, go into my head, and it's just that, my thoughts, and the words coming out of my mouth. And then now I'm like, is everything cool? Is everything working out? Do I need to check something? Wait, but I can't.
Where to look.
Yeah, so that's tricky. But really, it's pretty easy because we're just having a conversation about some movies. Mm-hmm. 2 movies, actually. A 2-for-1 deal this week. So, as I mentioned last week, we had a child, and by we, mainly I mean her. She did the majority of the heavy lifting on that one. We have a babysitter upstairs, which is great. Thank you, Stephanie.
Shout out to my sister.
So, we're not getting out a whole lot lately. So, it was a perfect opportunity, since we were going to be watching a bunch of spooky movies anyway, and we're doing spooky movies on the podcast. It was a perfect opportunity to sit down and watch some spooky movies and talk about them together on the show. And I've been wanting to have Grace on for a while now, so it's cool that it's finally happening. And so that's what's going on today. Welcome to our home. So the movies that we watched, it's a classic and it's modern retelling, Candyman, which I was not super familiar with before watching it this time. I actually was just doing some research on what are considered the best horror movie soundtracks of all time. And Candyman was like really, the 92 version, the original, was like really high on one of the lists. I was like, well, that's interesting. And it just had a reboot, so immediately I was like, okay, this might be cool to watch both of them and then kind of compare them and see what they do the same and differently. Because I had it built in my mind that, oh, this score was like really high on a list of greatest horror movie scores, I think I had a really high expectation. And I wouldn't say I was disappointed by the score specifically of the first one, but it definitely was not what I was expecting at all. And I was able to kind of get into it even more as time went on through the week, and just going back and listening to it. Like, it's a good listen. And then we went and watched. We were upstairs in our living room. We watched
We didn't go anywhere.
the 2021 version. And, well, we'll get into it more thoroughly, but suffice to say, it didn't, like, break any barriers, I wouldn't say. But yeah, so it was interesting. What's kind of your, like, high-level feelings on the movies and their scores?
Well, I didn't like the first one as much. We were talking to our friends.
I gotta say, we haven't really discussed this at all.
We really haven't. We tried our best not to.
Yeah, we watched them together, and we would start to have conversations about them either like right after or even like just during the day the next day. You're like, wait. Don't talk about it.
Talk.
Save it for the podcast. So we don't really know how the other feels about the movies or the scores very much. So with that out of the way, yes, we were talking to our friends about it.
Yes, we were talking to our friends, Keegan and his lovely wife, Piper. And I was like, I love horror films. They're kind of my thing. But the one thing I can't handle since getting pregnant and having a kid is a horror film that involves real people, kind of based on a true story, and especially if it involves animals or children. And this movie involves all of that. And it was painful to watch to the point where I don't have many notes on the first one because I was so distraught that I didn't even pay attention to the music that much.
Yeah.
Although I tried very hard.
Yeah.
Also, I went in watching them, hearing from Steven that it was rated as a really good soundtrack. So I was like, okay, this is going to be like complex and really good. And there are 3 songs that were created for the movie.
Yeah, that's about right.
And although they are very good, and although they're used multiple times in the movie, you don't really get sick of hearing them. And I think Glass even said that he's very into repetitive structures for his composition, so it made a lot of sense. So I enjoyed it, but I was also surprised by truly how simple it was and how little there was to hear.
Yeah. And then what about the new one?
The new one I liked a lot more, but I really liked the composer himself.
Okay.
I really found it interesting that he was raised a few blocks from Cabrini Green, which is the projects in Chicago. And that's kind of one of the main focuses of both movies. The first one is about Cabrini Green, and then the second one is about how they tore it down and rebuilt it. And so I thought it was interesting that he is very familiar with Cabrini Green, so he was able to, I think, add a lot of elements, understanding the atmosphere of it into the soundtrack.
Yeah.
And I thought that was really good.
As it comes to the score, so to kind of break it down, like you already said, there's basically 3 different pieces of music in the first Candyman movie. One is basically the Candyman's theme, the next is Helen's theme, and then there's kind of a theme for the third act of the movie that uses elements of both of them or instrumentation from both of them, but kind of has its own melodic structure, and it's just all throughout the third act. So as I was thinking about it, it's kind of similar to the original Halloween movie, where there's really only 3-4 pieces of music in that movie, and it gets repeated over and over again. It almost makes it more recognizable, or at least you understand what each piece of music is for because there's so few of them and they're repeated often. And like she already mentioned as well, the composer, his name is Philip Glass, and he's done a lot of movies, but he's actually like a classical music composer. He's written operas, symphonies, like he is a proper composer. That's his main work. And so he kind of started a movement or became popular for a classical musical movement called minimalism, which he actually kind of doesn't like the term to describe what he does, but it's what people identify it as. And it's essentially super repetitive structures. So it is a very multi-tonal, complex sort of musical structure for each piece, but the melodies repeat over and over and over again with just little variations here and there. So it's super repetitive, and it's almost more like a really dense soundscape of music than a sort of traditional melodic song. And it's really effective for this kind of movie. There are only 4 instruments that he employs in the whole thing. He uses an organ, a glockenspiel, I had to think of it for a second, a piano, and then a chorus or a choir. And that's it. But it's still a very rich, polyphonic score, and it's really cool. When we were talking about Halloween, I mentioned that all of the silence in Halloween feels intentional when you watch it. I don't necessarily get that vibe from Candyman. I think that he did the 3 pieces of music and they used it everywhere they could, but there's a lot of silence in this movie, and I don't think that it's just because it was on purpose and for a reason.
I think bits of it were on purpose. Like, I don't
Yes.
know if you noticed, but in the movie, if Candyman's walking, you don't hear his footsteps ever.
Mm.
And so I feel like stuff like that is on purpose, like almost like a question of is he real or not?
Mm-hmm.
Because you can't, there's nothing coming from him that makes any sound except, you know, what you hear in your head when he's talking to you.
Yeah.
But scenes in general, yes, there's really, it's a lot of emptiness. Like,
yeah,
they fill it with a lot of, like, soundscapes.
Mm-hmm.
You hear a lot of
sound effects and stuff.
like the city or the bees and all of that, but it's very quiet musically.
Yeah. I've been trying to think through the intention of using that minimalist musical style in this film in particular, and I've listened to the music over and over and over again at this point, even as repetitive as it is. And you get a feeling when you're listening to it, because it's repeated musical structures, you almost kind of lose a sense of time in a way, and you just kind of go into the music. And I think that that is very effective, not only for sort of the Candyman mythos, because it almost takes an element from like a Freddy Krueger type mythology, where like once he starts working on you, he is what is on your mind. So like once Helen, I mean obviously she's obsessed with it through the whole movie, but once he actually shows himself to her, she's constantly just being driven insane by either seeing him or hearing him or like thinking about him or trying to escape him. And so I think that in a sense, and this is something we talk about all the time that good scores do, is they either parallel or contrast what's happening in the movie. It parallels the character of Candyman and how Candyman works, because it is like once you are listening to the track, you kind of just absorb into the track almost. It's not as much like that with Helen's theme, because it's a very sort of like sweet piano theme, but it definitely is like that with the Candyman theme, I think, and then with the theme at the end, or in the third act. And so the musical style that's being employed here really lends itself to what they're trying to communicate the character does and how he works. I think, I don't know what I think. I'm probably going to cut out that I'm stumbling over that. I'm pulling a Keegan and not using notes this time. Okay, so then moving to the new one. And we haven't had as much time to like kind of sit on this one because we watched it 2 days ago now. It was good. I was a tad disappointed just by the soundtrack. I liked the movie fine. You liked the soundtrack better, didn't you?
I feel like the soundtrack brought a lot.
Yeah. So I'll throw mine in, and then you explain why I'm wrong. Well, and I probably maybe just didn't notice what I needed to notice out of it like you might have, but I felt like the strongest parts of the 2021 soundtrack were the pieces that the composer took from the original. Mm-hmm. So Helen's theme is brought back, the Candyman theme is brought back. You get a lot of musical nods to the original. They utilize the themes perfectly. Mm-hmm. I respect that a lot. I find it interesting, and I think this is a good thing, honestly. It's funny, I would actually classify this composer and this soundtrack as minimalist, because, and for the exact reason that Philip Glass didn't like his work being called minimalist, because it's not actually minimal or like light. A lot is happening. There's a lot of notes, a lot of harmonies, a lot of texture in his music, even though it's repeated melodies. In this one, he takes those themes and those melodies, but then there aren't nearly as many instruments and it's not nearly as complex. As I re-listened to it, I noticed that a lot.
Yeah.
You get like the melodic line, and then you might get like sort of a synthy fill underneath of it that's like a bass note or something like that. And then I don't think I ever heard more than 2 lines happening at the same time, and basically like a melody and a harmony, 2 lines happening at the same time. So it is very stripped back. When you just listen to it, there's a lot more space, I think. It's more ambient, you could say. And I think that that's effective in its own way. But yeah, I don't think even musically, I can think of 2 new pieces of music that were kind of added to the score, and they're very simple. Like, they're very simple pieces of music. One's just a very, like, back and forth dissonant type thing. It's the same, it's not the same notes, but it's the same distance between the notes as the Jaws theme. It's a 2-note back and forth in a very dissonant pattern. They introduce it very subtly earlier in the film underneath of the old themes, and then it comes back. Specifically, you hear it a lot in the scene where he goes and visits the reporter that's reporting on his work and gets her to say the Candyman thing. And then in that scene is also when he sees himself as Candyman in a reflection, and you hear that 2-note back and forth all over the place in that scene, and then it comes back a couple more times. And then the other stuff that's added is a lot of like 1-note kind of, it's very much like all horror movies now, where it's super stripped back and it's just sort of like an uneasy sort of tone. It's you can't even find an instrument to call it half the time. It's a tone. And so in some places it sounds like the opening note of The Dark Knight, where it's that like between notes of a like squealing violin. There's stuff like that. They do it in kind of a bassy way as well. And so there's not a lot melodically that's added. They almost strip back Glass's work and then disperse it. So there's not nearly as much of this movie that doesn't have music underneath of it. So it's good. I think I was just expecting it to be like out of the park. You know, I was expecting more. So it may say more about my expectations. I think I just wanted more out of the soundtrack.
Yeah. I think what I liked about it was they did keep the like minimalism. Lowe is known for only using his synthesizer and his voice to create music for anything he does. So everything you talked about makes sense. Like he didn't use any melody or didn't put really add a lot. He really just used his voice and his synthesizer to create music, which I liked. I like that kind of sound.
Yeah.
Because he did stuff with the Joker, and a lot of the songs that I like from the Joker are actually the songs he helped create.
It's funny, as we were listening to a few of the tracks before we recorded, some of those tones and like dissonant chord structures were like straight out of Joker. And I noticed that after you had mentioned that, I was like, oh,
yeah,
that's that same kind of like 2 notes colliding in a very like not brassy, but brash way that was all over Joker. It sounded really similar, and it was cool. It worked well for this one too.
Yeah, I think it captures kind of the dark theme of the movie, and I think that kind of style of music does really good at capturing the history, especially when you're going into Black history, and even if you talk about like slavery and all of that, because even you said you didn't hear any like African themes in the music, but I heard it really well. And I think most of it was the way that he used voices for the music.
That's a good point.
And the way that he utilized that was very, I think that added the tone of kind of like how African music can be.
Yeah.
And I like that a lot too. I think he added that in just the right moments. And he did a really good job of kind of doing what the original soundtrack did and capturing you into what's going on in the scene.
Mm-hmm.
You're not so focused on the music, and it's not so crazy that you're just listening to the music. You're like, you're brought into the scene really well because of that ambience.
I think for me, as a counter to that, I thought there were certain moments that the music made feel anticlimactic. Like, specifically, it was pretty laid back when that reporter got killed, and then the whole ending, after Brianna summons him at the very end, that whole ending, even though they were utilizing the old themes really well, it fell really flat to me because, and I re-listened to the tracks too, the music is very understated and it doesn't like rise at all, it's not loud at all.
Right.
So to me, that ending scene felt fairly anticlimactic. And I kind of blame the music for that because the scene itself is shot very well. It's being acted very well. So I can't, and it's a good payoff to the movie. So I can't point to any other piece of the film to explain why that last scene fell flat to me other than you should have pushed it a little further with the score.
Interesting. Yeah, because I wasn't, at that point I wasn't fully listening to the music.
Yeah.
And I was like so into the scene, I was like, oh my gosh, she's gonna call the Candyman, like I was like, this is happening, like her boyfriend's gonna come back and they're gonna be like a whole gang, like fighting crime, but like so I wasn't paying attention to the music, so I think I was just more into the scene.
Yeah.
Or maybe, I mean, the music must have been anticlimactic because I wasn't even like, oh, there's music here. Like, I couldn't tell you if there was or not.
Yeah. It was a little anticlimactic.
Okay.
I think that there is, when you're talking about these movies, I think they're really important films, specifically as horror films, because horror movies are very like white-dominated genre. And there's even like the trope of like if there's a black dude in a horror movie, they're probably going to be one of the first ones to die. So you don't see a lot of either. Well, now you kind of do with Jordan Peele making movies, but before him, you didn't see that very much at all. So it was interesting. And I'm not going to go into this a whole lot because I don't think we are the people to talk about it. So
we're pretty white.
Yeah. If you're just listening to this and you couldn't tell,
we are both very pale.
It was interesting. I was researching the first one, and okay, so Philip Glass is white, the composer. The director was white, and the main character is white. When they were making the movie, they actually had a couple meetings with the NAACP to have them like read the script and tell them if it was okay or not. Basically, is it okay to have a black antagonist or like a black, supernatural killer in the movie? And they were like, it would be a problem if you didn't do that, or if you didn't tell a story like that. That would be the more racist thing to do. That being said, when the movie came out, there were certain black critics that talked about, like, okay, there's still a lot of really unhealthy stereotypes in this. Like, there's obviously a white savior kind of storyline to it with, Helen coming in and saving the kid, and then, like, he mentioned the stereotype of, all the black people celebrating together as a community or commemorating things as a community because the entire community comes to Helen's funeral at the end.
Yeah.
And the bonfire, both of them.
Yeah.
So there were just a few different stereotypes that people at the time felt were just being reinforced by this movie. what I kind of noticed, though, is you have to look at it from the movie perspective and who is the story about? Whose perspective are we seeing the events taking place from?
Mm.
It's from the white protagonist. So maybe this is by design, maybe it's not, but of course the white protagonist is going to see these stereotypes. And so that's why I was really excited for the new one, is because the protagonist is black. And so you get to have a black perspective on a black story. And it did completely change the tone. And it completely changed the focus of what the Candyman legend was. So I think it is a super important couple of films.
Mm.
I don't know, I respect them a lot. Do you think that these movies are scary? Like, if you're thinking of them as movies, I think they're great movies. As a horror movie, compared to other horror films, do you think it's either of them are all that scary?
I wouldn't call it a typical. Well, it depends on your version of a horror
Mhm.
film. It's horrific in the sense that I think it's realistic,
Mm-hmm.
not the Candyman part, but like the part of the origin story of Candyman,
Mm-hmm.
and the fact that they actually recorded in Cabrini Green and actually used like gang members for the movie, and
Yeah.
the fact that they got shot at a couple of times for recording. Like, I think it is horrific in the sense that you see, especially in the new one, you see these people and they talk about their stories and you realize those things actually happen.
Mm-hmm.
But in the sense of a typical horror film, no, I don't think I got scared at all.
Yeah.
Well, especially the second one. I didn't get scared at all while watching it.
I didn't have any like jumps in the second one. I had one in the first one.
I think I cringed a few times.
Yeah.
Like, it's definitely more of a slasher. Like, if you're gonna call it
Yeah.
anything, I would call it more of a slasher, especially like scenes where like he cuts off someone's arm and inserts the
Yeah.
or you
It's
talk about
gruesome.
lynching and
Yeah.
in that sense, yeah, I call it a horror film. I even think after we watched the second one, I was like, it's kind of more like a thriller.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with that. I would say if you watched Halloween, like the original Halloween, and you thought that was scary, I would say this is a slight step up
Yeah.
in scariness, because it is a little bit more gruesome.
Yeah, and especially the first one is very similar to Halloween in the sense of the pacing of it.
Yeah.
It's very, I mean, as we said, like, you don't see Candyman until halfway through the movie.
Yeah.
So, like, it's very slow, but at the same time, because she's on, like, a mission to figure stuff out, you're not bored.
Yeah. To close out in talking about the scores. So obviously, like, this whole thing started because I saw it on a list of greatest of all time, and it was in, like, the top 5 of scores for horror films. And I can't decide if I agree with that or not. It's certainly not one of the most iconic, as in, I wouldn't have heard it and been like, oh yeah, that's Candyman. Whereas even before seeing Halloween or Friday the 13th, like, I knew what those themes sounded like. Or Jaws or something like that. So it's not iconic in the sense that, like, you hear it and you're like, ah yes, Candyman, unless you've seen it and you're really familiar with it. I wish that more horror movies used this musical style, specifically from the original.
Yeah.
But even because of how the original influenced the 2021 version and kind of took that modern minimalism up a notch, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
I wish more horror movies used music like this.
Well, I think,
or explored it.
Yeah, I think a lot of composers for Halloween films or horror films have fun with what they're composing.
Mm.
Whereas I think I was reading on Philip Glass, and he talks about how he really hates Candyman because when they explained the movie to him, he thought it was going to be this very artful, meaningful movie.
Mm-hmm.
And he was like, they made a dumb slasher film, and they used my music for it. And so I think he put a lot of effort and work into it, more than maybe some composers do for horror films.
Yeah.
And he took the story that he was told to create the music. And so I think it's just a lot more serious than you hear in a lot of horror films, and more thought out.
Yeah. I would agree with that for sure. It almost brought, it sounds like a piece of classical music.
Mm-hmm.
And that was one of the things I noticed while we were watching it. I was like, this is like a symphony underneath a horror film.
Yeah.
And I thought that was really cool. My hot take, maybe it's not a hot take, I don't think you have composers, specifically film composers, like Hans Zimmer or like who's the guy that's like really big right now? Ludwig Göransson, who did like Black Panther and did the Mandalorian and different stuff like that. But I don't think you have composers like that without Philip Glass. Because I think you can draw like a direct one-to-one line between the score that Glass did for Candyman and some of the work that Zimmer has done, because it is that very like soundscape, still epic, symphonic, but more immersive as opposed to melodic.
Yeah.
I would say Zimmer, it can err on the side of melodic a little bit more, but I think even though this is not a super well-known movie, like I don't think the original Candyman really was that well-known, it's kind of like the B tier of the classics.
Yeah, that's true. It's like one of the only horror films my mom saw, though.
Yeah. But with that, I think Glass's score specifically was influential on modern composers, which is really cool. I would say both of them are worth checking out. And I would say both the scores are worth listening to. And as you're watching them, I think that's the thing to think about is these scores are not about telling me what's going on so much as they're about immersing me in what's happening.
It's kind of telling me how to feel.
Yeah. So there's not as much to say in this one about, here's what this instrument is being used to represent, and here's what this means, and here's what this means. It's more, this is a tapestry of sound that's meant to like lay over you like a blanket and lay you into this movie.
Yes.
I don't know if that's a weird analogy. Oh my gosh.
Poetical.
But yeah, they're both very good, very worth checking out. But yeah, other than that, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Enjoy the rest of your Tuesday.